God bless you all.
Who's winning in Ukraine, and what should we do about it? Do Americans even know where Ukraine is? Hello everyone, I'm Bobtheorc, and today I will share my updated thoughts on the continuing conflict in Ukraine. But first, if you like what I'm doing, please like my videos, subscribe to my channels, and share them with your friends. I'm not advertising these things, and I put a lot of thought into it, so every little bit helps. So, before we really dive into the details, I think it's become pretty apparent to any honest observer that Ukraine is becoming a proxy war between the West and Russia, specifically the Biden admin, the other neocons in the American government, and their buddies in the EU, some of whom seem pretty enthusiastic to try and topple Russia, and others are a little bit more hesitant. This is largely being done, I think, through an economic war. I think the current plan from the West is to try and pump a lot of resources into Ukraine, drag the war on as long as possible, and try and economically crush Russia with sanctions. But is this actually working? Well, something interesting that I want to bring up is, let's look at the exchange rate right now. So, if we look in the past, traditionally, the Russian ruble, there'd be about 75 to 80 rubles per dollar. And this is pretty consistent, up until the beginning of the war. And then you see a big spike where the sanctions hit, where the value of the ruble dropped to essentially 140 to 150 rubles per dollar. But now the Russian economy seems to be stabilizing, or at least doing less badly than ours, and it's trading at about 65 to 66 rubles per dollar. This is a substantial improvement over the initial sanctions, and it's even a slight improvement to the pre-war economy. Now, we know that inflation is hitting Russia. I've got friends in both Russia and Ukraine, and I've been there recently. And even when I was there late last year, inflation was already starting to hit Russia. And just as inflation was already starting to hit the United States. I think you can make a very strong argument that the American sanctions, while not helping the situation, are certainly not the primary cause of Russian inflation nor American inflation. I think this has been happening beforehand. Now, the problem is that without trusting any media sources, I really don't trust what anybody's saying about any of this stuff. If the value of the Russian ruble is gaining strength compared to the dollar, and I know that prices are more expensive in Russia and prices are a lot more expensive in America, what this probably means is that the American economy is hurting worse, that the sanctions are adversely affecting the American economy worse than it's hurting Russia. And this is going to be probably a long-term conflict. I don't see the American neocons stopping their pressure anytime soon. I think that a lot of these guys have been wanting to start a fight with Russia, for a long time, for the last 10 years. And I certainly don't see the Russians backing down. And there's no way that Ukraine's going to back down either. Those guys are going to keep fighting as well. So if you think about it, this war is really going to come down to economics. Can Russia sustain its logistical efforts, and can Ukraine rely on the West for support? I think that the Ukrainian economy is probably largely in shambles right now. Even the Ukrainians admit that they're having some economic problems. And So from just the economics of it, we know that Russia is energy independent, which America used to be for a brief time, and then we screwed that up. We know that Russia is independent as far as food, which America is as well. Russia is largely manufacturing independent, which a lot of people don't realize. Now, they're reliant on the West for high technology items, but as far as their basic industrial goods, they make their own equipment, they make their own appliances, they certainly make their own military hardware. And while they're reliant on Western chips for their advanced weapons, their basic blow stuff up equipment, they can make that easily on their own, and they probably can even make limited smart munitions on their own as well. I know that Russia's been trying to develop their own chip industry. I think it's just not as advanced as the West. Now, from the Western perspective, our energy prices have been going up long before the Russian war. And I'm calling this the Russian war because realistically, let's just call it like it is. The American government, for whatever insane reason, is trying to declare war on Russia, largely because these neocons just like war, and I'm sure they're getting rich in the process. Certainly their defense contract buddies are getting rich. And they're pumping a lot of money into Ukraine. Originally it was just, a few $100 million, then a couple billion, and now they're wanting to throw in another $33 billion. And we know that Ukraine is an insanely corrupt country. We've known this for a long time. I love Ukraine. I've got a lot of friends there. But their government is kind of corrupt. They've got this little oligarch problem. And we know all about the 10% for the big guy and all this stuff. It's not just the Democrats. The Republicans are in on it too. There's a lot of money that's getting laundered through Ukraine. And I'm sure that the neocons want to keep this war going as long as they can, because I'm sure they're getting wealthy off of it, or at least their buddies are. I would be shocked if a substantial portion of the money we send to Ukraine isn't getting embezzled and finding its way back into various politicians' pocketbooks or that of their friends. Now, regarding Western Europe as a whole, Western Europe is heavily reliant on Russia for energy. And Russia is initiating a policy where they're going to make the West pay for oil and gas and other resources eventually in rubles. And how they plan on doing this is they're going to make you deposit, dollars or euros into a Russian bank. And then the Russian bank will convert it to rubles at an exchange rate determined by how much they like you, which means that if you're Hungary, which seems to be trying to stay out of this, then they might get 60, 70 rubles per dollar. And if you're Britain or Germany, which is or certainly Poland, which is sending a lot of support into Ukraine, then they're probably going to give you 50, 40 rubles per dollar. They're going to probably screw you a little bit. And that's a clever move on the part of the Russians. They know that they've got Europe by the balls when it comes to energy. And I seem to recall, people warning about this in the past. I know that there was a long while back, the Greek energy minister was talking about that Europe should invest into solar, Greek solar, because Greek houses have a sunlight, on the rooftops and whatnot, and that would be a good energy investment. I know that a certain unpopular American president was saying that it would be insane for Europe to be dependent on Russia, that the pipelines were a bad idea. And yet Europe's been shutting down nuclear plants and other things, and relying on Russia. So this is sort of an I told you so moment for them. And I think that's going to really hurt the European economy. Now America is more energy independent than Europe is. We were energy independent until the current administration decided to curtail on what we're doing energy wise. And and then I understand the environment, and we'll talk about that in a different video. But from a strategic standpoint, Russia, when you look at real economy, they are largely independent of the West, whereas the West is more dependent on the global markets, and Europe in particular is more dependent on Russia. So I think from an economic standpoint, Russia is going to withstand the sanctions quite well, and the blowback from this is going to be that people are losing faith in the dollar as their world's reserve currency. It doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. I'm not going to get into morality. You guys know that I leave morality out of this. I just talk about what is and what is not. And the reality of banking is this. The reason the American dollar is the world's reserve currency is people know that if they put their money into the dollar, into American banks, that it's safe. And when we start sanctioning countries, it puts a little bit of doubt into that. And when we start seizing assets, like what we're doing with Russian assets, other countries are taking notice. They're like, if we get on the bad side of American government, then they might take our stuff. And it doesn't really matter if they like Russia or not, but it's putting some doubt in the American dollar. And the Russian government has stated that one of their objectives is to destroy the American petrodollar as the world's reserve currency. They've talked about this long before the war. The Russian position is going to be that they're going to use what levers they have against us, just like we're using what levers we have against them. So I think that this could end up being very damaging to the American economy, which is already having a lot of problems because of our government's insane policies and the aftermath of our overreaction to COVID. From an economic standpoint, that is, we printed trillions of dollars and we put, a tremendous amount of stimulus into the economy to mitigate COVID. And that's going to bite us in the ass as well. So we already have a weakened economy. And when I was last in Russia, the Russian economy seemed to be on the ascension. The people had what I would describe as a cultural momentum. So I think when it comes to the economic war, I think Russia's going to do okay. I don't see any reason why we're going to topple the Russian government through economic sanctions. Now, logistics is another aspect. Early on in the war, there was a lot of reports about Russian logistics problems. And these logistics problems were mostly taking place in the Kiev area, especially north of Kiev. And this is because the Ukrainian supply lines were relatively short in the west. They're getting most of their supplies, through Poland, through Lviv in the west, and then on to Kiev. And the Russian supply lines were relatively long, having to pass through Belarus. And the Ukrainian military was taking a clever approach to where they were targeting Russian supplies and logistics, which is exactly what they should be doing from a strategic standpoint. Now that the fighting is moving into the east, which, the fighting was always in the east, but rather the Russians are abandoning their positions in the west and focusing on the east. Now, the Russians are going to claim that this was always the plan. The Ukrainians are going to claim that, well, we kicked your ass in, north of Kiev. I think the reality is that the Kiev offensive was probably a gambit. Russians like gambits. If you're familiar with chess, a gambit is a maneuver that's sort of a calculated risk, where if you can pull it off, you get a high reward for a manageable risk. And it often involves a little bit of sacrifice to achieve a strategic objective. I think that there was the possibility that Zelensky was going to bail out of Kiev and that the government would collapse, and that didn't come to pass. Now, were the Russians counting on it? I doubt it. I think that was it'd be nice if it happens kind of thing. Most leaders will bail when their city is under siege, and Zelensky happened to have a pretty big set of balls and stayed and fought. Assuming he's not actually in Lviv or somewhere else. But certainly he put on a strong show of force and strong will to resist. So there was no reason for the Russians to continue north of Kiev. The Russian army is smaller than the Ukrainian army. At least the offensive forces that Russia's committing is probably originally about 100,000 or so troops, and Kiev probably has double. Ukraine probably has about double or triple that available, and that's a growing number. And the reason is that Ukraine can conscript troops for its defense, but Russian conscripts can only be used for the defense of Russia. They can't be used in offense. Conscripted troops are historically lousy offensive troops. You need professional soldiers for the offense. Now, Russian strategists or commentators, if you listen to Eastern media, they're going to talk about, oh, this is no big deal. And maybe it's not. The Russians are going to claim that they're inflicting tremendous losses on Ukraine. Ukraine's going to say that they're inflicting tremendous losses on Russia. That's really hard to say, and I don't trust anybody's numbers. Now, what I will say is that most of the Russian casualties were probably caused or probably suffered in the areas north of Kiev. They had that long column that got kind of stalled up. And that's probably where Ukraine was able to do most of their damage, because the Ukrainian troops were very skilled at hit-and-run ambush-style tactics, attacking the Russian logistics. Now, that being said, it also appeared that most of the vehicles that were being used in the north were largely older, less capable Soviet-era type vehicles. And it would seem that the Russians were holding most of their good stuff in reserve. At least that was what was often commented by various observers. Now, in the East, it's a different story. It's important to remember that the Russians have been fighting in the East for probably at least 8 years. Now the Russians will claim that it was the Donetsk or the Donbass independent militias or whatnot. But we all know that those were supported by the Russians. Just like we all know that a lot of these Ukrainian forces are really being supported by Americans. I would be absolutely shocked if there weren't recently retired American or NATO soldiers that are assisting Ukraine on the quiet. Just like I would be shocked if there weren't recently retired Russian soldiers helping out the Ukrainian, the Donbass militias, the ethnic Russian militias in East Ukraine that were resisting the government. And I think that's pretty much been confirmed that was the case. I think the Russians are admitting to that now. So, in the East, the Russians have always had better logistics because they've been fighting there for a long time. And you don't hear about a lot of the logistics problems in the East. And certainly in the South, coming out of Crimea, Crimea is basically a fortress. It's essentially an unsinkable, island fortress. And they've got a lot of supplies there, too. And my understanding is the Russians have some sort of bridge that they can help ferry supplies from Western Russia into Eastern Crimea. And now that they've secured this land bridge, which I think was always a strategic objective, even early on before the official what do they call it, special military operation started. This was talked about back in 2014, that the Russian forces would try to connect Crimea to the rest of Russia, and through the Donbass. And this was talked about when I was there in Ukraine back in 2014 and again in I believe 2019. So the situation in the East is not the situation in north of Kiev. The Russians are not going to have this logistics problem. And furthermore, the eastern fighting areas are more favorable. It's more open fields where the Russians are better at. The logistics chains, the supply chains are longer, because, at this point, Ukraine is really dependent on the West for their supplies. I'm sure that Ukraine's used up a lot of their munitions and equipment, or what they have is already committed. So any additional equipment is going to have to get shipped in through Poland into Lviv and then spread out from there. Now, the Russians have been largely avoiding fighting in cities because city fighting sucks. I think that there's certain cities they had to take, like Mariupol. If you look at some of the highway maps, the highways go through Mariupol, and it'd be very inconvenient to bypass that. But if you look at what's going on in Kharkiv, I think that the Russians are going to just try and encircle it. If you look at what's going on in the eastern Donbass areas, where there's the majority of the Ukrainian forces, I think they're going to largely just try and encircle it. And this is pretty typical of Russian strategy going back as far as I can think of. Certainly in World War II, the Soviets would do that, encircle and siege. And I believe even in medieval times, the Russians were a fan of encirclements and siege-type warfare. And this is because the Russians have big-ass artillery. And they're, when you're in the open fields, even if you're in dug-in positions, they're going to artillery the crap out of you. When you're in a city, it's harder to artillery the city. America is really good at dropping precision weapons into cities and largely avoiding collateral damage. The Russians aren't as good at that because it's never been really that much of a concern. Normally the Russians will just level cities in their path. And in Ukraine, that has not been happening as much. Now, I understand that there's Ukrainian reports that there's been a lot of damage to cities, but compared to what you saw happen, in World War II or in Chechnya, the damage to Ukrainian cities has been relatively minor. And I think the reason for this is that the Russian citizens have a generally favorable opinion of the Ukrainian citizens. Now, I realize that many Ukrainians are not so favorable towards the Russians, but if the Russian army starts doing a lot of collateral damage, that's not going to play well back home. And, the Russian people, at least from what I can determine, they're tentatively supportive of assisting the ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine, but their support is probably a bit tepid. It's probably a bit conditional. They're not going to tolerate a lot of civilian casualties. Now, in certain areas, like in Mariupol, where they're fighting the Azovs primarily, I think that the Russian people, don't care so much about the casualties there. Now, keep in mind that the Russian perspective on collateral damage is vastly different than an American perspective on collateral damage. The Russians have a much higher tolerance for casualties than Americans do, and the Ukrainians as well. And that's why this is a much more brutal conflict than what we would see, in even when we were in Iraq or Afghanistan. We were very careful about not suffering American casualties. If we lost, when we lost 13 U.S. soldiers pulling out at Afghanistan, that was a tragedy. That was, there was huge upheaval about that in the media, and even, even the Democrats are like, oh, Biden, you screwed up. In Russian media, if the Russians suffer 13 casualties, that won't even make the news. They have a much higher tolerance for casualties because they understand what war is really like, whereas America's never really had to fight this kind of war, not really since World War II. Where there was a massive combined arms fight. Now, the Ukrainians are probably largely defending their cities because that's their strong points. I'm not sure how mobile their army is. And, they're going to... And they know that fighting in cities is very difficult for the Russians. And I suspect that the Ukrainian plan is to hold the cities, endure the siege as long as they can, and hope that Western sanctions crush and topple the Russian government. But like I said, I don't think that's going to happen. So, when you think about who's winning, well, in eastern Ukraine, I think that, Ukraine probably still has a solid hold on Kharkiv. Their positions in the Donbass area are well prepared, and I think they've been holding that reasonably well. But I think they're suffering casualties. They're probably suffering a lot of casualties. They're not going to admit it, and we can't trust anything that the Russians say. But it's open field warfare where the Russians can indiscriminately use their large artillery munitions without having to worry about civilian collateral damage. So, yeah, I would suspect that in the open fields of eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainian army is probably not doing so well. In Kharkiv, they're probably doing quite well because I think that the Russians are still very hesitant to push in on Kharkiv. Mariupol, I think, at this point is pretty much wrapped up. The Russians have a very solid connection between the Donbass and Crimea. I think that in the Mykolaiv and Odessa area, I think the Ukrainians are holding that quite well. But I don't think the Russians have pushed into that too hard yet. I think that early on, the Russians probably spread their forces too thin. They probably were, if I'm to be generous to the Russians, I would say that they were probably probing the Ukrainian defenses to see where would be the strong points and where would be the weak points. And then you hit where the enemy's weak. And if I'm to be not so generous to the Russians, I think they overextended themselves and they paid a price for it, and they had to reconsolidate their forces. And that was probably a costly lesson. But one thing to consider is that military commanders are usually very quick to readjust their strategy. The Russians are very adaptive. The old saying is they don't go to the bathroom without a plan. And I think that they're readjusting their strategy quite well. I think that the Ukrainians are adjusting quite well, and I'm sure they have a lot of American advisors and various satellite, information. I'm sure that we're providing them with all kinds of targeting data and whatnot. I'd be shocked if we weren't. And so I doubt there's anything that the Russians can do that the Ukrainians don't know about, at least on a large scale. Just like I doubt there's anything the Ukrainians can do on a large scale that the Russians won't know about. I think that Ukraine's going to keep some forces near Kiev because, if they lose Kiev, the game's up. And I think there are probably still some forces up in Belarus waiting to sweep in. And Belarus, who's an ally of Russia, they've got some military forces as well. I don't think they're as capable as the Russian troops are, and they're certainly not as capable as the Ukrainian troops are. But if Ukraine drops the ball, I think Belarus is in a position to sweep in. And I think that Ukraine has a lot of forces guarding Lviv. Lviv is their primary logistic staging area, I would suspect. And there's also got to be some concern that if Ukraine starts to really get its butt whooped, that Poland may sweep in and retake the traditionally Polish territory that Poland lost in World War II and never got back after the Soviet era. So there's got to be some trepidation, because I think the Poles like the Ukrainians, but if it looks like Ukraine's going to get gobbled up by Russia, then I don't see why Poland won't sweep in and grab what they can during the fire sale. So I would say that right now, Russia's probably going to be successful. As I've always said, they're going to be successful in the East where they have the advantage. And whether they're successful more than just the East is going to largely come down to what Ukraine does. If Ukraine loses a lot of soldiers fighting in the Donbass, which could happen, I think that the Russians are trying to encircle them, and it's starting to happen. At some point, Ukraine's going to have to make the decision: do we keep holding on, or do we pull out and save our forces? If Ukraine gets its army destroyed, then Russia could certainly sweep through. Now, I think that Ukraine's going to probably do a fighting withdrawal at some point. I don't think they're going to sacrifice their army just to hold on for a little bit longer, but you never know. I don't think Russia's going to get their army annihilated. They're playing things very slow and cautious, and as they would describe it, they're very carefully, systematically dismantling the Ukrainian military. And I think that the Russians are going to be as careful as they have the means to be, within practical reason, to avoid civilian casualties. That's going to slow down their advance quite a bit. There's some talk of the Russians trying to disentangle, I think is how they put it, disentangle the civilian populations from the Ukrainian resistance. And the Russians are probably primarily concerned with destroying the Azovs and some of the more, what I would originally have described as the oligarchs' private armies, although it seems that, Azov and some of these other forces have been fully integrated into the Ukrainian defense force. But I think that targeting these people whom the Russians would describe as Nazis, I'm not going to make a judgment on that. Although some of these people have poor taste in symbols that they wear on their clothing, and some of these people reportedly have poor taste in the tattoos they wear. But I think these guys are largely mercenaries, and I think that the oligarchs, just like any powerful individual or criminal organization, because the oligarchs are basically Ukrainian mobs. They're going to employ hired muscle, and they're not going to ask too many questions. If I'm to be, generous to the oligarchs. So I think that the Russians are going to focus on trying to take out, the Azovs and people like that. I think they're going to probably try and convince the rest of the Ukrainian army to surrender. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't see any realistic. I don't see any real probability that the Ukrainian army, that the professional army would surrender en masse. I think it might happen to some degree, but the Ukrainians are all in on this. They're not gonna. I don't think they're gonna back down. I think the only way that you're going to get a surrender is if they're completely encircled and sieged, and they run out of ammunition and food and water, and they just have no choice. And even then, I'm not so sure. So I think that if Ukraine's smart, they're going to do like a fighting withdrawal, and if they're not smart, they're going to, hold to the last and eventually get encircled in the east. I think if the Russians are smart, they're going to do a very slow and systematic advance. They're going to be very careful about it. And I think that the Russians are going to probably increasingly target Ukraine's command and control systems. Russia certainly has the capability to do it. They've got, largely all the same satellite capabilities that we have. They may not have as many as America has, but Russia has satellites. They've got precision, standoff munitions. They've got all the same goodies that America has. They probably don't have as many, because the Russian focus has always been on cheaper munitions that they can use in mass. But they've got some stuff. And so I think that you're going to see perhaps some surgical Russian attacks, at a distance. But they're certainly going to be more careful than they were before. They lost that big ship, and they've lost a bunch of their parachute units and other things. The Russians are going to have to be more careful. And I think that we're seeing that now, which is why this is why the pace is slowing down quite a bit. But the Russians are good at that, and the Russians are very patient, and we shouldn't forget that. And I think that gives them a big advantage over Ukraine, because remember, Ukraine is largely dependent on Western support, whereas Russia is able to maintain this mostly on their own, I think. They're getting some support from China, but they apparently don't need as much as I would have originally thought. And Americans are fickle. Remember, this is very personal to the Russians. Ukraine is more important to Russia than it is to America. I think that America has the midterms coming up. I think we have an inflation problem. We have our economy had a receded by 1.4% in the first quarter of 2022. So Americans are starting to suffer economically. You've got this leaked document about Roe versus Wade and about the Supreme Court possibly overturning it. And now Americans are arguing quite a bit about that. So I think that you're going to see Americans have a lot of other priorities. And supporting Ukraine is really more of a priority of the Biden admin and the neocons, and not so much about the American people. I think the American people, support Ukraine and want to see Ukraine do well. I think they want to see Ukraine be independent and not be engulfed by Russia. And certainly nobody wants to see lots of people die. I mean, I think even the Russians don't want to see lots of Ukrainians die. I think that's why they've been so cautious about this. But the reality is that, when it comes down to Americans having trouble paying the bills and the leaders wanting to send money to Ukraine, I think the Americans would be like, nah, you better take care of us first. We've got that big problem on the border with millions of illegals swarming across. So I think that the Americans have a lot of priorities that are not Ukraine, and that's going to be very unfortunate for Ukraine, because I think Ukraine does not have the stockpile of equipment and munitions. They certainly have the manpower. They've got lots of people. Ukraine has like 40 million people, and I think at least several million of them have military training. So the Ukrainians, if they have the equipment, can field a much larger army in eastern Ukraine than the Russians can. That's never been in doubt. Even the Russians admit that. But does Ukraine have the economics and the logistics to sustain that? And I don't think they do without Western support. And I think that the West would have been smarter to not sanction Russia and just supply Ukraine with stuff. It would have certainly pissed off the Russians less. And if you are going to supply Ukraine, don't brag about it. The whole idea behind covert operations is you're supposed to keep it a secret. Unfortunately, the West has a long history, or at least a recent history, of having inept leaders. Whereas, people might not like Putin, but he's competent. Lavrov, their foreign minister, I believe is what his title is. He's competent. They have the Russian political class, the Russian leadership has always been able to punch above their weight class, making Russia appear to be a much more powerful country than it, might seem on paper. Americans will often talk about how Russia has a smaller economy than California, or they have a smaller economy than Italy, or smaller economy than New York. But the Russians punch way above their weight class compared to any of these places. If Italy got pissed off at somebody, nobody would care. No offense to it. I like it. I like Italians. I've got a lot of Italian friends, and Italian food is great. But nobody really cares if the government of Italy gets pissed off at somebody. Russia punches above their weight class. That's just a reality. They've always, even during the Soviet era, the Western economy, the American economy, dwarfed the Soviet economy. And yet the Soviets gave America a run for its money. The West was terrified of the Soviets, even though the Soviets were never going to win an economic fight. And the same is true in modern Russia. The modern Russians, they punch above their weight class. They've got a cultural unity that we do not have in the West. We're still busy trying to figure out what bathroom to use, where these guys have a cultural momentum. They have a clear goal. They're going to, reclaim the territories of the Russian, ethnic Russian people, however they define it. And I think they're going to do it. So what do we do about all this? I mean, I think that the obvious solution was to have enforced the Minsk agreement a long time ago and prevented the war, because this could have all been easily prevented. And I am still convinced that the only reason that there's a war in Ukraine is because the Biden admin wanted a war in Ukraine. Hell, back in 2015 elections, you had Hillary talking about, a no-fly zone in Syria and shooting down some Russian jets just to show them. These neocon guys have been wanting to fight Russia for a long time, and now they have their fight. And I don't think it's working out the way that they thought it would, because Russia's not going to collapse. A bunch of my CNN watching friends are like, "Oh, it's only a matter of days. Putin's going to be out of office in days." Well, that was 2 months ago. That's not happening. That was never going to happen. Putin may not be the nicest guy in the world, although by what I'm told, many of the Russian political class consider Putin to be a moderate. Dear God, if Putin's the moderate, you don't want to fuck with their hardliners. Certainly not if you're, some of these incompetent fools in the Biden administration. They can't deal with that. So no, I think that the obvious solution is to negotiate peace. The problem is every time there's been an opportunity to negotiate peace, we've screwed it up. The Russians have been offering peace negotiations since the very beginning, since before the war, and even after, all this started. They've been wanting to negotiate. Now, are they negotiating in good faith? Well, I don't know. I'm not a diplomat, but we know that on several occasions the Zelensky regime was close to having some form of agreement, and then they suddenly backed down. And there's a lot of talk that the Biden administration and EU allies were saying, no, back down. We'll provide you with all the stuff to fight. You can win this. You can win this. We believe in you. We've got your back. Well, we've got their back now. What's going to happen in the midterms if the neocons take a shellacking? And I'm not talking about Democrats or Republicans in particular. There's neocons in both parties. But, there's an anti-war movement that's been growing in America ever since, Afghanistan. That's probably why Biden so recklessly pulled out of Afghanistan the way he did. Americans don't want war. We're busy focusing on our own problems. We got bigger fish to fry. And there's no conflict between the American people and the Russian people. The conflict is only between the American government and the Russian government. And frankly, the American people don't like the American government that much. Even the Democrats don't like the Democrat leadership that much, at least, from the Democrats I know. So I think the only solution for Ukraine is to negotiate peace as quickly as possible, because I think the American support can't be relied on. And this has been consistent through a lot of conflicts. A lot of my European friends and Middle Eastern friends always joke that American support in a conflict is very hit or miss, because, American leadership changes every 2 to 4 years. One of the advantages of a regime like Russia or China is that they can do long-term planning, because it's the same leaders year after year. Now, that may not represent the will of the people, or maybe it does. I'm going to stay out of Russian politics because I don't begin to understand it. But, certainly a disadvantage of having different leaders, continuously is that long-term policy is hard to maintain. Now, the advantage is that it makes the American government very adaptable to the will, to what people are wanting right now. But I don't think that Ukraine can guarantee that there's going to be long-term Western support. I think the West will support them to some degree or another, but I think that in order to maintain the fight, I think they're going to need a lot of help. And I don't know how much America's willing to put in. I don't know how much Europe as a whole is willing to put in. And it almost seems like a lot of the stuff that we're sending Ukraine is older stuff now. Does that mean that we already used up our supply of advanced man-portable weapons? Maybe we did. Early on, the Russians were suffering a lot of vehicle loss due to these, advanced weapons that Ukraine had. We had given them a lot of stuff during the Trump administration. We'd given them more stuff, I think, recently. and they, Britain gave them a bunch of stuff. My understanding is they had a lot of man-portable weapons that were capable of destroying tanks, certainly from the side or from the top, and taking out low-flying, slow-moving aircraft. Especially the helicopters. The Russians suffered a lot of losses to their helicopter fleet. Are we still sending those, or are we sending older weapons because we're out of the good stuff? I don't know. So now, as average Americans, as everyday Americans, there's not much we can do. We obviously don't have any control over what our government does. Otherwise, we would have not been in this conflict in the first place. I think that, Americans largely would have preferred to negotiate peace, and I think that when it comes out that our leaders were sabotaging the peace negotiations, I have no proof of that. That's just my gut feeling, because and I'll get into why I think that in a minute. I think that as that comes out, the American people are going to get more and more upset about all this. And I think that, like I said, the Biden administration sabotaged the peace negotiations because the war is great for them. Biden has terrible poll numbers. The economy sucks. The energy industry is having trouble. Prices are going up. Inflation's through the roof. He can't really blame all this on Trump. He certainly can't blame. He's trying to blame this on Putin, but any honest observer knows that the American economy was having a lot of trouble before this. He can try to blame it on COVID, but COVID's largely over. They're proving to be very incompetent. And I don't think that's a partisan position. I think that any objective analysis of the American government is that our government is not particularly competent right now. And you could make the same argument under Trump too if you want. I wouldn't argue with that. I think that the Trump admin screwed up a lot during COVID as well. And Biden's poll numbers are down. A war is always good for the poll numbers. It galvanizes the people, and it gives you a lot of stuff you can hide a lot of bad press under, national security arguments. All of the weapons and stuff that we're sending to Ukraine is going to be great for the defense industry. Wars tend to spur the economy. And a lot of money's going to go missing because that's what always happens during a war. And I'm sure that the big guy's going to get his 10%. Yeah, I'm never going to let that one go. I mean, that's what y'all get for, electing one of the most corrupt people in history. So, I'm not saying that you guys should have elected Trump. I'm saying, my position's always been we need better candidates. But no, I mean, we know that there's a lot of reasons why the neocons that are running the American government right now want there to be a war. So I think that this will continue as long as they're in power. But I don't think that they're concerned with winning. I think they're concerned with dragging it on and getting rich, because that seems to be how Americans have fought wars, ever since World War II, really. I mean, certainly, Vietnam on. The military-industrial complex wants to, sell a bunch of weapons. And, we seem to always put in a bunch of half-assed efforts. So I think we're going to probably half-ass Ukraine, because that's what American military doctrine seems to be in the modern era. Plus, if we got into a full-scale war with Russia, that would get very bad very quickly, and I don't think anybody wants that. Meanwhile, like I said, I think Russia's going to make slow and steady advances, and it's just going to be a matter of, can Russia produce weapons fast enough to maintain, can they produce munitions fast enough to maintain their level of advance? And I think that the Russian military has a clear understanding of their capabilities at this point. Whenever you start a large-scale conflict, something new always happens, and you have to adapt. I think the Russians probably have adapted by now. That's why you see the change in tactics, and that's why you see the slow, methodical approach. And they have a certain capacity to wage war. They're going to probably wage it within that capacity. And I don't think they're going to overstretch themselves again. I think they've learned their lesson. So anyway, so that's my analysis for this. I know it's a little bit long. You know, Dad likes it when I make short 5-minute videos, but I had a lot of thoughts that I've been kind of collecting for the last month since I made my last video. And I think that from the American perspective, we need to solve our own problems and we need to try and negotiate peace. I don't think the Russians are going to trust us at this point to uphold our end of the bargain. You know, I think that the Biden administration and the neocons have lost all credibility within the eyes of the Russians, and I don't think the Russians have a lot of credibility in the eyes of the Biden admin either, you know, because they're going to say, well, you guys said you were just doing a training exercise in Belarus and then you went and invaded. Well, I mean, the Russians were already in Ukraine. The fighting in Ukraine's already been happening for 8 years. I mean, we should have solved this like 8 years ago. You know, probably the smart thing would have been to not start the Ukrainian civil war in the first place. You know, not do the color revolution in the first place. Let the Ukrainians deal with their own country. Because whenever America gets involved, you know, in trying to push our stuff in other countries, it always turns to shit. And so I largely blame these neocons, you know, for a lot of the mess in Ukraine from, you know, going back to what, like 2013. So yeah, we need peace. I don't think we're going to get it. I don't think we have anybody who can negotiate at this point. And we're certainly not going to stop supplying Ukraine with stuff. So I think that the war is going to continue at least until after the midterms. If the neocons suffer a shellacking in the midterms, then maybe policy will change. My understanding is a bunch of insurgent candidates are winning primaries. So, you know, we'll see what happens, and we'll see what happens, you know, with American domestic issues. Things may get so crazy in America domestically that we may take our focus off of Ukraine. Although, frankly, I think that would just make it easier for the Biden admin to send more stuff to Ukraine without the American people going, hey, where's all our money going? So, as American people, as regular citizens, I think we just need to vote all these guys out of office. Both parties. Screw them all. I think we need to brace for impact as far as inflation and a bad economy. I think we're going to get into recessionary inflation, maybe even recessionary hyperinflation. My dad has a book on that subject. I'll put a link to the book. You can find it on my website, Bobtheorc.com. But I think we need to focus on our own problems, because we're going to see a lot of domestic problems, coming up. And I don't think we're going to have the capability to keep supplying Ukraine with all the stuff they need. So I think that we need to work out a peaceful solution as quickly as we can. And the fear is, Russia said they'll continue to advance as long as the West is fueling this war. And they may do that too. Now, I think they're going to have a hard time getting into Western Ukraine. Just like I think that, Ukraine's going to have a hard time holding on to the East. But I think that you're going to see the Ukrainian forces in the East either have to withdraw or they're going to get encircled and annihilated. And then I think you're going to see the Russians make a move on Odessa, because why wouldn't they cut Ukraine off from the sea? The Odessa area, I believe, is traditionally has a large ethnic Russian population. And if you think about it, the Russians are going to take, Putin's going to take whatever he can, as we present him with the opportunity. I think that he's going to be very pragmatic about it. I don't have any special insight into Putin's thinking, but just my observations of the man over the years, he's certainly a chess player, and he'll take advantage of opportunities that are given to him. And I think as long as we give him the justification to keep grabbing more of Ukraine, I think he's going to do it. And I think that's going to be very unfortunate for Ukraine. So, my take is the best thing for the Ukrainians would be to negotiate peace now while they still have the majority of their country. I do not think that America is going to come to Ukraine's rescue, because I don't think we have the capability to do so. I think that our domestic problems are going to overwhelm us, coming up. If we had a 1.4% contraction of the economy just in the first quarter, that means that 2022 is going to suck. And, Ukraine's not that important to the American people. I mean, it sucks, but that's the reality of it. It's terrible what's happening in Ukraine. I think all of this could have been prevented. But yeah, I mean, the adults need to go and negotiate peace before the lunatics continue to escalate the war. Because if we don't put a stop to this, then I think Russia's going to put a stop to it, and we're not going to like how Russia does it. They're just going to keep grabbing up all the territories traditionally held by ethnic Russians. They may grab all of Ukraine. If the Ukrainian military collapses, then you could see Russia surge in, and it wouldn't surprise me if Poland goes and grabs a little bit of the West that used to be theirs. So I'm not very optimistic about what's going to happen. I think a lot of people are going to needlessly die, and we need to wrap this up quickly. And I don't think we have anybody in the American government who's willing to do that. Certainly nobody in any sort of power. I think a lot of these neocons, Biden and all of his cronies, and the Lindsey Grahams and Adam Kinzinger, that idiot. These guys all think we're still in the Cold War. We haven't been in the Cold War for like 30 years. Russia's not the Soviet Union. These guys need to understand that. It's a totally different thing. Russia's rejected communism. These guys are more akin to, the traditional, Russian monarchy, the Russian Empire, of medieval times. Putin's basically the Tsar of Russia. Their political class is basically the Russian nobility. That's the closest analogy I can come up with. And, these guys are going to be very systematic about it. And we need to get our game together, because we're not in a position to win this, I don't think. Anyway, I'm sorry for the bleak outlook, but that's just reality. We're not going to take this thing nuclear. I know some of the idiots in the American government have talked about that, but we're not going to do that. The American people would revolt if we started a nuclear war. Because the American people don't have any real animosity towards the Russian people. I think the American people are largely indifferent. It's really the American political class fighting with the Russian political class. But I don't think the American people or the Russian people want to fight each other. And so, like I said, most wars are all about economics and a battle of wills. I think Russia's going to win because, they're economically self-sufficient. They're losing a lot of their luxuries and they're having a lot of problems, but they're self-sufficient. They're not gonna economically collapse. I think the Russian ruble trading very, very strongly against the dollar shows that. Russia's gone to some sort of gold standard, or they're backing their currency with a combination of gold and other commodities, gold, oil, gas, grain, whatever. The American dollar is just based on what people think it's worth. It's based on the full faith and credit of the United States. So Russia's not going to lose economically. They may not win economically, but they're not going to be economically defeated. And the will of the Russian people about Ukraine is stronger than the will of the American people about Ukraine. Now, obviously, the Ukrainian people aren't going to give up, but if they run out of supplies, then that's it. So, is Europe going to be able to supply all of Ukraine? They'll do it for a while. What happens when Europe has their own internal problems? No, I think we need to wrap this thing up and negotiate peace while we still have some advantage, but it's probably too late for that. Anyway, so there's my bleak outlook for the 5th of April, or May rather. I'm sorry, we're in May. Yeah, for the 5th of May. And I think that we can expect this to last a long time at this point. I think it's going to be a very slow, unless the Ukrainian army collapses completely, which I don't think that's going to happen. I could be wrong, but I think that at some point they're going to have to do some sort of fighting withdrawal. But as long as the West is supporting Ukraine, this is going to continue, and I think this is going to be a slow, methodical, systematic progression. Remember, the Russians have been in this for 8 years. This is new to us. We're only just now finding out, oh my God, it's been happening for 2 months. No, Russians have been doing this for 8 years. This is nothing new. And this is nothing new to the Ukrainians either. When all this first started happening, and I called up one of my Ukrainian friends like, hey, what's going on? She said the same thing that's been going on for the last 8 years. There's no real change. The Russians are just, being more aggressive about it now. So, anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like I said, please like the video, subscribe to my channel, share it with your friends. And I'll see you guys next time. Hopefully I'll have a happier topic next time. All right, goodbye.